The autumn mist clung to the grounds surrounding the Belgrave Hotel like a shroud, its tendrils weaving through the gas-lit streets of Mayfair as carriages deposited London's most distinguished citizens at the grand entrance. Inside, the Quintin Foundation's spring dinner blazed with warmth and the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled guests in the hotel's magnificent banqueting hall. The room shimmered with pale golden mirrors, adorned with a profusion of ferns and white lilies that filled the air with their delicate fragrance. "My tie, Hastings," murmured Poirot, intent before the cheval glass in our small antechamber, his meticulous nature asserting itself even in such trivial matters. "Observe, it is not the tie that displeases me. It is the deviation, however small. It is always the small details, mon ami." "You look perfectly turned out," I assured him, though to my untrained eye the ensemble appeared mathematically perfect already. He arranged a sprig of lily-of-the-valley in his lapel with the precision of a master craftsman, sighed with evident satisfaction, and descended to join the gathering like a small, supremely confident field marshal preparing for battle. Sir Lionel Quintin met us at the doors, his bronzed, solid frame imposing in evening dress, a benevolent bulldozer of a man whose philanthropic endeavours had made him a fixture in London society. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, delighted you could join us. We're quite an intimate gathering tonight, only the Foundation's closest supporters and a few special guests. There's to be a toast for the new wing at St. Clement's Hospital." Poirot bowed with characteristic courtesy. "Mais non, Sir Lionel. I am here merely to listen and observe." We were introduced to the assembled company with the usual pleasantries. Lady Isabel Quintin, tall and elegant as a swan, wore the famous Quintin emeralds in a cold green line at her throat, their brilliance rivaling the intelligence in her keen eyes. Miles Dacre, Sir Lionel's secretary, hovered nearby, a pale, dutiful young man whose neatness would have pleased Poirot but for its self-effacing quality. Conrad Arkwright, the northern industrialist whose bluntness had become something of a charming trademark, dominated one corner of the room with his hearty laughter, while his wife Astrid watched him with quick, anxious eyes that seemed to anticipate trouble. Miss Lila Vane of the London Gazette moved through the gathering like a determined butterfly, her journalist's instincts sharp as her pen nib, while Reverend Paul Dane, a mild clergyman with a schoolroom voice, provided a soothing counterpoint to the evening's more forceful personalities. Peter Quintin, Sir Lionel's nephew, lingered near the windows, his thin mouth suggesting opinions not yet restrained by steady employment or social grace. But it was the unexpected guest who drew the most curious attention. Celeste Montfort. She introduced herself with a slight inclination of her elegantly coiffed head. "A tiresome friend of Miss Vane's. I confess I've come to observe how the philanthropic sausage is made." Dressed in deep emerald green that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the gaslight, she possessed those modern, intelligent eyes that suggested perpetual amusement at the world's follies. "She arrived without warning," Miss Vane whispered to me with evident satisfaction, "and Sir Lionel absolutely despises surprises. Should make excellent copy for tomorrow's edition." Dinner progressed with the proper ceremony and a musical interlude by the hotel's quartet that was too polite to be particularly memorable. Poirot, seated beside me, allowed himself small nods of approval at the symmetrical arrangement of place settings and the precise timing of each course. The conversation flowed as expected. Peter declaiming on public ownership with youthful passion, Arkwright laughing at such idealistic notions, Lady Isabel diplomatically smoothing troubled waters, and Miss Vane adding sparks of wit to keep the discussion lively. Celeste Montfort remained largely silent throughout the meal, contributing only occasional smiles that suggested she viewed our animated discussions as a rehearsal of lines already familiar to her. There was something unsettling about her watchful calm, as if she possessed knowledge the rest of us lacked. When the champagne for the evening's toasts arrived, Sir Lionel rose with practiced authority. He required no knife against crystal to command attention. Silence fell like a theatre curtain. Placing one hand upon the back of his chair, he glanced briefly at a small card beside his plate, and for the first time that evening, I detected a flicker of nervousness in his usually confident demeanor. "To the future," he began, his voice resonating through the dining hall. "To the bridge we shall build across fear," said Celeste Montfort, distinctly and coolly, completing the phrase before Sir Lionel could utter the words himself. The effect was electric. A curious ripple of laughter containing equal parts amusement and profound discomfort swept the table. Sir Lionel's jaw checked for the smallest fraction of a second before he recovered his composure with admirable skill. "Precisely, my dear Miss Montfort. To the bridge we shall build across Fear, and to St. Clement's new wing." He carried on smoothly, but something fundamental had shifted in the evening's carefully orchestrated harmony. Poirot, I noticed, did not join in the nervous laughter. His sharp eyes moved not to Celeste, but to Miles Dacre, who had gone distinctly pale, and to Lady Isabel, whose hand resting upon a silver salt cellar had trembled before becoming perfectly still. We drank the toast, but the easy conviviality had been replaced by an undercurrent of unease. Arkwright, whose hearty nature made him a natural peacemaker, leaned toward Reverend Dane with some jest, about fear requiring practical action rather than metaphorical bridges. He lifted his glass again to emphasize the point, but his wife's gentle touch on his sleeve gave him pause. "Conrad," she began, but he was already coughing. It started as a simple, human sound, incongruous among the crystal and silver. Then he coughed again, a dreadful rattle accompanying it, and his face altered dramatically, suffused and terribly wrong. The champagne glass clinked against his plate as his fingers scrabbled with odd stiffness at his collar. He attempted to stand, failed completely, and collapsed across his chair, like a man succumbing to sudden, violent illness. Astrid Arkwright's cry of her husband's name would haunt my memory for years to come. For one terrible moment, the elegant dining hall held its breath. Then chaos erupted like a dam bursting. Astrid Arkwright's cry of anguish pierced the air as she threw herself toward her husband's motionless form, her hands fluttering helplessly over his collar, his face searching for some sign of life that was no longer there. The champagne glass lay on its side, its golden contents spreading across the white damask like a guilty confession. "Stand back, please." Dr. Pemberton, one of the Foundation's board members, pushed through the circle of horrified guests, his medical training asserting itself over social protocol. He knelt beside Arkwright's sprawled figure, fingers seeking a pulse that would not be found, checking for breath that had already ceased. The examination was swift but thorough, and when he rose, his face bore the grave expression I had seen too often during my military service. "I'm afraid Mr. Arkwright is dead," he announced quietly. "The symptoms suggest rapid poisoning, possibly an alkaloid compound. Death would have been nearly instantaneous." The word poisoning fell upon the assembly like a physical blow. Lady Isabel moved with instinctive grace to support the newly widowed Astrid, while Miss Vane, her journalist's instincts warring with human decency, clutched her small notebook with trembling fingers. Reverend Dane began murmuring a prayer under his breath, and Peter Quinton stared at the locked doors with the expression of a trapped animal. "Do not touch anything," said Poirot softly, but with such quiet authority that every movement in the room ceased. He rose from his seat with characteristic precision, his keen eyes already cataloguing the scene before him. "Nothing must be disturbed. Captain Hastings, if you would be so good as to ensure the doors remain secured." Sir Lionel, his face ashen but his voice steady, nodded grimly. "Miles, telephone Scotland Yard immediately. Ask for Inspector Japp if he's available." He turned to the hotel staff who had begun to gather at the doorway. "No one enters or leaves this room without Monsieur Poirot's express permission." Miles Dacre hurried toward the telephone, his usual composure shattered, while Poirot moved with deliberate care around the table. He did not touch the overturned champagne glass, but observed it with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. With meticulous precision, he covered it with a clean napkin, then placed an inverted glass over it like a protective dome. "The pattern must be preserved," he murmured, his gaze moving to each of the remaining champagne flutes. "Each glass tells its story, and we must not allow the stories to become confused." Celeste Montfort, who had maintained her remarkable composure throughout the crisis, watched Poirot's methodical movements with undisguised interest. "How very thorough of you, Monsieur Poirot," she observed, her voice carrying that same unsettling calm that had marked her interruption of Sir Lionel's toast. "Though I confess, the irony is rather striking. A toast to building bridges across fear, followed immediately by the most fearful event imaginable." Poirot's eyes fixed upon her with sudden intensity. "Indeed, mademoiselle, and it was you who completed Sir Lionel's toast before he could speak the words himself. Most remarkable, considering that Monsieur Dac has just informed us the toast was written only minutes before dinner." The observation hung in the air like an accusation delicately wrapped in silk. Miles Dac, returning from the telephone, nodded vigorously. "That's quite right, Monsieur Poirot. Sir Lionel dictated the words to me in the anteroom just before we were seated. I wrote them on his place card myself. Yet Mademoiselle Montfort knew them precisely," Poirot continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the weight of his words. "How does one explain such prescience?" Celeste's smile never wavered. "I've always been observant, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps I glimpsed the card as it was being prepared, or overheard Sir Lionel rehearsing. Memory can be such a curious thing." "Can it indeed?" Poirot's head tilted slightly, like a bird considering an interesting specimen. "Yet Sir Lionel is known never to rehearse his speeches. Is that not so, Sir Lionel?" Sir Lionel, his face flushed with anger and confusion, nodded curtly. "I never rehearse. I speak from the heart, always. That is, everyone here knows that." The arrival of Inspector Japp brought with it the familiar atmosphere of official investigation. The Scotland Yard man surveyed the scene with practiced eyes, his weathered face grim as he took in the tableau of suspects arranged around their fateful table. "Another poisoning, Poirot?" he asked without preamble. "And you happen to be present as usual." "Indeed, mon ami, though this particular crime presents features of most unusual interest." Poirot gestured toward the assembled guests, who sat frozen in their chairs like actors awaiting their cues. "Observe the closed circle, the precise timing, the curious matter of the prophetic toast." As Japp began the routine procedures of securing the scene, I noticed that Poirot's attention had become fixed upon the small place card that lay beside Sir Lionel's setting. The card had been displaced during the confusion, but its position remained significant, visible to several guests, including Miles Dacre, Lady Isabel, and most notably, Celeste Montfort, whose seat provided a direct line of sight to Sir Lionel's preparations. "The little grey cells, Hastings," Poirot murmured to me as we watched Japp begin his preliminary interviews. "They are already most active. This is no crime of passion, no sudden impulse. None. This required planning, precision, and most importantly, knowledge. Someone at this table knew exactly what would happen tonight, and when." His gaze swept the assembled suspects once more, lingering momentarily on each face, reading the fear, the guilt, the desperate calculations that lurked behind their carefully maintained facades. The game, as he would say, was afoot. The elegant dining hall, with its crystal chandeliers and pristine white lilies, had become a stage for murder, and Hercule Poirot was about to conduct the most important performance of the evening. Inspector Japp moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had seen too many crime scenes, his weathered hands directing the positioning of screens and the careful documentation of evidence. The hotel staff retreated like ghosts, leaving only the essential personnel and the assembled suspects who remained frozen in their chairs like actors awaiting their cues. The elegant dining hall had transformed into something far more sinister, a stage where death had made its dramatic entrance. Poirot, meanwhile, conducted his own investigation with characteristic precision. He positioned himself at the exact spot where Sir Lionel had stood to deliver his fateful toast, his keen eyes sweeping the table with the intensity of a master clockmaker examining the inner workings of a particularly complex timepiece. Every glass, every piece of silverware, every displaced napkin seemed to speak to him in a language only he could understand. "The champagne service," he announced quietly to the room, his voice carrying that peculiar authority that made even Japp pause in his work. "It was conducted how, precisely?" The hotel's senior waiter, a dignified man named Pembroke, whose 30 years of service showed in every careful movement, stepped forward nervously. "From a single bottle, Monsieur Poirot. I opened it myself at the serving station and filled each glass in sequence, beginning with the ladies and proceeding clockwise around the table. Standard protocol, sir. And the glasses themselves, they were arranged upon the table for how long before service?" 20 minutes, sir. I placed them according to the seating chart provided by Mr. Dacre, each one inspected and positioned according to hotel standards. Poirot's gaze moved to Miles Dacre, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. 20 minutes, he repeated thoughtfully. Sufficient time, perhaps, for someone with access to make certain preparations. Dr. Pemberton, who had remained silent since pronouncing Arkwright dead, cleared his throat hesitantly. "Monsieur Poirot, during my examination I detected a distinct almond scent about the deceased. Combined with the rapidity of onset and the specific symptoms, I believe we're dealing with cyanide poisoning. In the concentration required for such rapid death, the victim would experience difficulty breathing and loss of consciousness within 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Ah, cyanide, Poirot mused, his fingers steepled before him. Swift, efficient, requiring only a small quantity. Yet this presents us with a most intriguing puzzle, mes amis. If all glasses were filled from the same bottle, how did the poison reach only Monsieur Arkwright? While Japp began his official interviews in the adjacent morning room, Poirot remained in the dining hall, conducting his own form of investigation. He approached each suspect not with the blunt instrument of direct questioning, but with the subtle art of observation and inference. Celeste Montfort sat with an unnerving placidity, her emerald dress a stark contrast to the morbid atmosphere. When Poirot addressed her, his voice carried no accusation, merely curiosity. "Mademoiselle, you possess remarkable composure given the circumstances. What purpose would panic serve, Monsieur Poirot?" She replied, meeting his gaze unflinchingly. "It would not bring Mr. Arkwright back. Besides, I find human drama endlessly fascinating, especially when it unfolds with such theatricality." "Indeed, theatricality. And you played a most intriguing part in tonight's prelude. The toast you completed before Sir Lionel could speak the words. How did you acquire such precise knowledge?" Celeste's smile never wavered. "I offer 2 explanations, Monsieur Poirot. First, Sir Lionel used nearly identical words at the Guildhall luncheon a year ago. I wrote about it then, and phrases with rhythm tend to stick. Second, I glimpsed the card as it was placed. The reflection in Sir Lionel's spoon made it legible from my seat." 2 explanations when most would offer 1, Poirot observed. "Why?" "Because I will not be trapped later by remembering too well, and because you would prefer candor to coyness." Miles Dacre, growing increasingly pale, suddenly spoke up. "I prepared the seating chart, Monsieur Poirot. I knew exactly where each guest would be positioned." The admission created ripples of suspicion throughout the room. Astrid Arkwright looked up from her handkerchief with sudden sharpness. "You knew Conrad would sit in that exact chair." "The seating was arranged according to protocol," Dacre replied defensively. Sir Lionel's preferences, social precedents. It's all quite standard. But from the morning room came Japp's voice, sharp with discovery. Sir Lionel, you're certain you didn't ask Dacre to move Arkwright's seat? Sir Lionel's response carried, clearly. Absolutely not. I made no such request. Poirot's eyes shone with sudden interest. He moved swiftly to the doorway where he could observe both rooms. Now we approach something most significant. Monsieur Dacre, you moved Monsieur Arkwright from his original position, yet Sir Lionel did not request this change. Who did? The silence that followed was electric. Miles Dacre stood frozen, his face a mask of confusion and growing fear. I thought someone must have... Someone who knew, Poirot continued softly, that Monsieur Arkwright must be positioned precisely where the poison could reach him. Someone who understood that the seating arrangement was not merely social courtesy, but a matter of life and death. Peter Quinton suddenly stood, his face flushed with indignation. This is preposterous. We're all sitting here like criminals while a murderer walks free among us. Sit down, Peter, Sir Lionel commanded from the morning room, unless you have some particular objection to discovering the truth. As the young man reluctantly resumed his seat, Poirot's gaze swept the assembled suspects once more. The pattern was beginning to emerge, not yet complete, but visible to those who knew how to look. The crime had required not just opportunity and means, but precise knowledge of timing, seating, and human nature itself. The little grey cells, he murmured to me as we watched the interplay of fear and guilt across the suspects' faces. They tell me this was no crime of passion. No, this required planning, precision, and most importantly, intimate knowledge of everyone present. Someone at this table orchestrated not just a murder, but a perfect theatrical performance. The elegant dining hall, with its crystal chandeliers and pristine white lilies, had indeed become a stage, and Hercule Poirot was about to direct the final act. The morning room, with its pale yellow walls and comfortable chairs arranged in precise formation, became Inspector Japp's domain for the methodical process of formal interviews. Each suspect was called in turn, their footsteps echoing across the polished floor as they faced the weathered Scotland Yard man's direct questioning. Meanwhile, Poirot remained in the dining hall, conducting his own form of investigation with the delicate precision of a master surgeon examining a particularly complex case. Miles Dacre was summoned first, his nervousness having intensified to the point where his hands trembled visibly as he took his seat before Japp's stern gaze. The secretary's pallor had not improved, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool evening air. The seating arrangement, Japp began without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of long experience. You moved Arkwright from his usual position. Sir Lionel says he gave no such instruction. Who did? Dacre's response came in stammering fragments as he produced a small piece of hotel stationery from his waistcoat pocket. I received this note this afternoon, Inspector. It was slipped under my door. I assumed it came from Sir Lionel, requesting the change. Poirot moved swiftly to examine the note, his keen eyes taking in every detail of the handwriting. The message was brief but specific. Please seat Mr. Arkwright in position 7 rather than his usual chair. The acoustics will be better for tonight's toast, LQ. The initials suggest Lady Quinton, Japp observed, but Poirot's head shook slowly, his expression thoughtful. Non, mon ami. Observe the formation of the letters, particularly the Q. This is not the natural hand of someone accustomed to signing Lady Isabel Quinton. The flourish is wrong, the pressure uneven. This is the work of someone attempting to implicate Lady Quinton while concealing their own identity. When Lady Isabel herself was shown the note during her interview, her reaction was immediate and decisive. She examined it with the careful attention of someone well-versed in detecting forgeries, her aristocratic bearing never wavering despite the circumstances. This is certainly not my handwriting, Inspector, she declared with quiet authority. Moreover, I would never presume to alter seating arrangements without consulting my husband directly. Such matters are entirely his province, and he knows I respect his judgment in all social protocols. The revelation about Arkwright's usual seating preference cast the entire evening's arrangement in a sinister new light. Lady Isabel explained that the industrialist was remarkably particular about his position at formal dinners, always insisting on the same chair near the fireplace, always facing the room rather than the wall. He said it was a businessman's habit, she explained, her voice steady despite the implications. Never sitting with his back to potential competitors or threats. He was quite adamant about it at every foundation gathering. Poirot's attention shifted to Reverend Dane, whose clerical training had made him an observant witness to the evening's subtle undercurrents. The mild-mannered clergyman had noticed details that others might have dismissed as inconsequential. "I was speaking with Mr. Arkwright just before the toast," Reverend Dane explained, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He seemed particularly agitated, more so than usual. He was complaining about his champagne, actually. Said it tasted rather flat, which struck me as odd, given that champagne is specifically prized for its effervescence. This detail brought Poirot to an almost imperceptible halt, his mental machinery clearly processing the significance of a complaint about flat champagne from a man who would be dead within minutes of making it. The observation suggested that Arkwright had detected something amiss with his drink, perhaps the very substance that would prove fatal. Miss Lila Vane's interview provided additional insights into the evening's carefully orchestrated deception. Her journalist's training had led her to catalogue details that others might overlook, painting a picture of deliberate manipulation beneath the veneer of social propriety. Celeste's behavior was particularly unusual, she explained to Jap, her sharp eyes reflecting professional curiosity. She's normally quite chatty at social gatherings, yet she remained almost silent throughout dinner, watching everyone with the intensity of a predator studying its prey, and her knowledge of the toast, that was genuinely unsettling. When Astrid Arkwright was finally called for questioning, her composed grief began to crack under Jap's persistent inquiries. She admitted that her marriage had been troubled, that Conrad's drinking had worsened considerably in recent months, and that she had been seriously considering legal separation. "But I would never have harmed him," she insisted, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Whatever our differences, Conrad was still my husband. I may have wished for freedom from his increasingly erratic behavior, but certainly not through murder." The widow's testimony revealed another crucial detail. Conrad had received a letter the previous day that had disturbed him greatly. He had burned it immediately after reading, but not before she glimpsed the signature. Two initials that sent a chill through the assembled company. C.M. Poirot, who had remained largely silent during these formal interviews, finally stepped forward as the implications of this revelation settled over the room like a shroud. His little grey cells were clearly forming connections, weaving together the threads of deception, opportunity, and motive into a pattern that was beginning to emerge from the shadows. "The psychology of this crime," he murmured to me as we observed the interplay of fear and guilt across the suspects' faces. "It reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in small details. The forged note, the flat champagne, the prophetic toast. Each element carefully planned by someone who understood not just the mechanics of murder, but the human nature of everyone present. The elegant morning room had become a confessional, and each revelation brought Hercule Poirot closer to the truth that lay hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The completion of the formal interviews brought Inspector Japp back to the dining hall, with the determined stride of a man who believed the pieces were finally falling into place. His weathered face bore that expression of grim satisfaction I had learned to recognize over our many cases together, the look of a Scotland Yard man who had found his quarry and was prepared to close the net. "Pembroke," he called to the hotel's senior waiter, who emerged from behind a screen carrying a folded garment that gleamed darkly in the gaslight. "Show me what you found in the ladies' cloakroom." The waiter approached with obvious reluctance, holding what proved to be an elegant green velvet wrap. This was left behind, Inspector. In the pocket, he produced a tiny stoppered vial, no larger than a woman's thumb, its glass surface catching the light with sinister promise. Japp accepted the vial with practiced care, removed the cork, and inhaled briefly. His expression hardened immediately. Bitter almonds, the unmistakable scent of cyanide. His eyes fixed upon Celeste Montfort, who remained seated with that same unsettling composure she had maintained throughout the evening's horrors. "This wrap belongs to you, Miss Montfort." "Indeed it does," she replied without the slightest hesitation, her voice carrying that measured calm that had marked her interruption of Sir Lionel's toast. "The vial contains essence of bitter almond, Inspector. I use it occasionally in perfumery, a rather continental habit that I suspect you find suspicious." "I find cyanide suspicious," Japp retorted sharply, "particularly when it appears in the possession of someone who demonstrated uncanny knowledge of tonight's proceedings." Before Celeste could respond, Astrid Arkwright looked up from her handkerchief with sudden intensity. "Inspector, there's something else. Conrad received a letter yesterday that disturbed him greatly. He burned it immediately, but I glimpsed the signature, 2 initials, CM. The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. All eyes turned to Celeste, whose perfect composure finally showed the first hairline crack. She rose gracefully from her chair, moving toward the window where autumn mist continued to swirl through the gas-lit streets. "I will not deny writing to Mr. Arkwright," she said, her back to the room. "But the truth is rather more complex than you might imagine. Conrad Arkwright was blackmailing me." The confession fell upon the gathering like thunder. Even Poirot, who had been observing with characteristic intensity, showed a flicker of surprise at her directness. 3 years ago, I was involved in a financial scandal concerning the Meridian Bank," Celeste continued, turning to face her accusers. "Nothing criminal, but professionally ruinous for a journalist. Arkwright discovered my involvement and has been extracting payments ever since. Yesterday's letter contained his latest demand, a sum that would have left me destitute." Japp's pencil moved rapidly across his notebook. "Motive, opportunity, and means," he announced with satisfaction. "You knew the victim would be here tonight. You had access to the dining room when the glasses were laid, and you possessed the poison. The case is clear enough." "Is it indeed?" Poirot interjected softly, his head tilted in that characteristic pose of deep consideration. "Yet observe, mon ami, the psychology of this confession. Mademoiselle volunteers information that incriminates her, provides details that establish motive, and does so with remarkable composure. Is this the behavior of a guilty person attempting concealment?" Peter Quinton, who had grown, increasingly agitated, suddenly exploded from his chair. "Psychology be damned. She's admitted to every element of the crime. How much more evidence do we need?" "Evidence of guilt or evidence of something else entirely?" Poirot moved to stand before Celeste, his keen eyes studying her face. "You came to dinner tonight knowing you would face your blackmailer." "Why?" "Because I intended to expose him publicly," she replied without hesitation. "I had gathered sufficient proof of his extortion schemes to destroy his reputation as thoroughly as he had threatened to destroy mine." This revelation cast Arkwright's evening agitation in an entirely new light. If he had known his blackmail activities were about to be revealed before London's philanthropic elite, his nervousness became perfectly understandable. Japp, however, remained focused on immediate evidence. "The vial, the wrap, the letter, the motive, it all points to you, Miss Montfort. I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Conrad Arkwright." As the inspector moved to take her into custody, Poirot stepped forward with quiet authority. "Mon ami, permit me one observation. If Monsieur Arkwright was blackmailing Mademoiselle Montfort, might he not have been blackmailing others as well? A man who would extort one victim would likely extort many, particularly if he had access to secrets through his extensive business connections." The suggestion sent visible tremors through several suspects. Miles Dacre's face went ashen. Lady Isabel's fingers tightened around her handkerchief, and even Reverend Dane seemed to shrink into his clerical collar. "The little grey cells," Poirot murmured to me as Japp led Celeste away. "They tell me we have arrested not the murderer, but the most convenient suspect. The true killer remains among us, watching this performance with considerable satisfaction." The elegant dining hall had become a stage where justice and deception danced their eternal ballet, and Hercule Poirot was far from satisfied with tonight's first act. As Inspector Japp's footsteps faded down the hotel corridor with Celeste Montfort in custody, the remaining suspects sat in the elegant dining hall like actors uncertain whether their performance had truly ended. The crystal chandeliers cast the same warm light, the white lilies maintained their pristine beauty, yet something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere, a tension that suggested the evening's drama was far from concluded. Poirot remained motionless beside the fatal table, his keen eyes moving from face to face with the intensity of a master chess player contemplating his next crucial move. The little grey cells were clearly working at maximum capacity, processing details that others had dismissed as inconsequential. "A most convenient arrest, wouldn't you say, Hastings?" he murmured, adjusting a stray napkin with surgical precision. "All the pieces fit, perhaps, but they fit too easily, like a puzzle designed for a child, when we know this murderer possesses the cunning of a master." He moved to the serving station where Pembroke had prepared the champagne service, his attention focused on minute details that had escaped everyone else's notice. "Pembroke, if you would indulge me, bring 2 fresh glasses and demonstrate once more your method of service." The senior waiter obeyed with grave precision, producing clean flutes and a fresh bottle. Poirot observed the ritual with characteristic intensity, then made an unexpected request. "Now, if you please, a small quantity of almond oil from the kitchen." When the oil arrived, Poirot took a glass rod and traced the thinnest possible film around the inner rim of one flute. "Observe, mes amis," he said, signaling for both glasses to be filled. The difference was immediate and startling. One glass bubbled with golden effervescence, while the other lay flat and lifeless. Reverend Dane started visibly. "Flat," he murmured, as if repeating his own testimony. "Just as Mr. Arkwright complained." "Précisément," Poirot confirmed. "A film no thicker than a thought, and the champagne loses its gaiety. The taste becomes altered, suspicious to a discerning palate. Our unfortunate Monsieur Arkwright tasted his doom before he drank it." Miles Dacre, who had grown increasingly pale during this demonstration, suddenly stood with jerky, uncontrolled movements. "I can't bear this deception any longer," he announced, his voice cracking with strain. "There's something I must confess about that seating note." The admission struck the room like lightning. Every eye fixed upon the secretary, whose carefully maintained composure had finally crumbled under the weight of his secret knowledge. "I knew the handwriting wasn't Lady Isabel's," he continued, producing the forged note with shaking fingers. "I've handled her correspondence for 3 years, but I was terrified to admit I'd been deceived, terrified of appearing incompetent. So I said nothing and moved Mr. Arkwright exactly where the murderer needed him to be." Lady Isabel rose with swift grace, placing a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder. "Miles, you cannot blame yourself for another's manipulation. Whoever wrote that note used your conscientiousness as a weapon." Poirot's head tilted in that characteristic pose of deep consideration. "Indeed, and observe the psychology of this crime. The murderer did not merely react to circumstances, they orchestrated them. The forged note, the precise seating, even the very words of Sir Lionel's toast. Tell me, Sir Lionel, did the phrase 'bridge across fear' come to you entirely unbidden?" Sir Lionel's face flushed with confusion. "I wrote that toast myself this afternoon. The phrasing is entirely my own." "Entirely?" Poirot's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. "Or perhaps an idea, a phrase, a sentiment was planted in your mind. Subtly, indirectly, so that you would believe it to be your own original thought. Someone who could predict your words because they themselves had suggested the phrasing. The implication hung in the air like an accusation delicately wrapped in silk. Around the elegant dining hall, the remaining suspects shifted nervously, each wondering if they had just heard the methodology of Conrad Arkwright's killer being systematically exposed. It was then that Reverend Dane rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his scholarly demeanor transformed into something far more predatory. The gentle clergyman who had murmured prayers over the deceased had become someone entirely different, watchful, calculating, dangerous. "The psychology of this crime does indeed fascinate me, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his mild clerical voice carrying an edge that chilled the room. "The careful planning, the manipulation of human nature, the theatrical timing, it suggests someone with intimate knowledge of each person present." The transformation was remarkable and terrifying. His pale eyes fixed upon the assembled company with the intensity of a hawk studying its prey, and his words carried the unmistakable tone of professional appreciation for criminal artistry. Poirot's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. The little gray cells had clearly made a crucial connection, one that would soon transform this gathering from a collection of frightened suspects into an audience for the revelation of truth. The game, as he would say, had taken a most interesting and dangerous turn. The transformation in Reverend Dane's demeanor was subtle yet unmistakable, like watching a theatrical mask slip just enough to reveal the calculating intelligence beneath. His scholarly appreciation for the crime's methodology struck the assembled company with the force of recognition. Here was someone who understood the murderer's mind not through deduction, but through intimate familiarity. "The psychology of manipulation," Dane continued, his mild clerical voice carrying new undertones of authority, "requires an understanding of human nature that goes far beyond mere observation. One must know precisely which strings to pull and in what sequence to achieve the desired symphony of deception." Poirot moved with characteristic precision to the serving station, his keen eyes never leaving the clergyman's face. "Indeed, mon reverend, and such knowledge suggests either exceptional insight or personal experience. Tell me, during your pastoral duties, do you often encounter the darker aspects of human nature?" "Constantly," Dane replied with unsettling calm. "The confessional reveals truths that would shock the innocent. Blackmail, extortion, the slow destruction of souls, these are the realities behind respectable facades." The admission hung in the air like an accusation wrapped in clerical authority. Sir Lionel shifted uncomfortably, while Lady Isabel's fingers tightened around her handkerchief as she studied the man who had seemed so harmless moments before. Poirot began his methodical reconstruction, positioning himself at various points around the table with surgical precision. The murderer required not just opportunity, but the ability to guide events. "Consider the toast, mes amis. Sir Lionel, when did the phrase bridge across fear first occur to you?" Sir Lionel frowned, his confidence shaken. "This afternoon as I prepared my remarks. Though now that you mention it, the concept had been in my thoughts for several days. Someone, I cannot recall who, mentioned bridges as metaphors for charitable work." "Ah, the planted seed," Poirot murmured, his gaze fixed upon Reverend Dane. The suggestion so subtle that the recipient believes the idea to be entirely his own creation, a technique requiring considerable psychological sophistication. Miles Dacre, who had grown increasingly pale, suddenly stood with jerky movements. "The note about the seating change, I've been thinking about the handwriting. It wasn't just a poor forgery of Lady Isabel's signature. The style was deliberately archaic, like someone accustomed to manuscript work." The observation struck the room like lightning. Reverend Dane's pale eyes flickered, not with surprise, but with what might have been professional appreciation for the secretary's deductive abilities. "Medieval manuscripts," Lady Isabel breathed, understanding dawning in her intelligent eyes. "Paul studied paleography at Oxford. He's shown me examples of his calligraphy work for the parish records." Poirot nodded slowly, the pieces of his mental puzzle falling into place with satisfying precision. The forged note, the planted phrase, the precise timing, all requiring someone with intimate knowledge of everyone present. Someone who could predict behavior because he had studied it professionally. As if responding to some internal signal, Reverend Dane rose from his chair with deliberate grace. His transformation was now complete. The mild clergyman had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a predator who had worn benevolence like a perfectly fitted disguise. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice carrying that same scholarly tone but now edged with something that chilled the room. "You speak of prediction and manipulation as if they were somehow improper. Yet surely a detective employs similar techniques, observing, analyzing, guiding suspects toward revelation." The comparison was both astute and deeply unsettling. Poirot's eyes sharpened as he recognized the challenge implicit in Dane's words. Acknowledgement of intellectual equality between hunter and hunted. "There is perhaps one crucial difference," Poirot replied softly. "The detective seeks truth. The murderer seeks only to escape it." Before Dane could respond, a sharp crash echoed from the serving area. Miles Dacre had been attempting to steady himself against a side table when his trembling hands knocked over a silver tray. As he bent to retrieve the scattered items, his face went ashen with terror. "Monsieur Poirot," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's something here. Something that wasn't here before." Hidden beneath a fallen napkin lay a small vial, identical to the one found in Celeste Montfort's wrap. But this one bore a different significance. It was positioned precisely where only someone moving through the serving area could have placed it. Someone who had anticipated this very moment of discovery. Poirot examined the vial without touching it, his expression grave. "The game continues," he announced to the assembled company. "Our murderer is not content with a single arrest. He wishes to ensure that suspicion falls upon multiple suspects, creating a web of confusion that will obscure the truth indefinitely." Reverend Dane watched this development with that same unsettling calm, his pale eyes reflecting neither surprise nor concern. If anything, he seemed pleased by the evening's continued complications, as if each twist in the investigation provided him with fresh intellectual stimulation. The elegant dining hall had become a stage where truth and deception danced their eternal ballet, and Hercule Poirot realized that his opponent was far more sophisticated than he had initially suspected. The little gray cells would need to work at their maximum capacity to unravel this particular web of psychological manipulation. The game, as he would say, had indeed taken a most dangerous and fascinating turn. The discovery of the second vial sent ripples of unease through the assembled company, but it was Poirot's reaction that proved most revealing. Rather than examining the evidence with his usual meticulous attention, he stepped back from the serving area with that characteristic tilt of his head that indicated his little gray cells were working at maximum capacity. "Most instructive," he murmured, his keen eyes moving from the planted vial to Reverend Dane's composed features. "The murderer wishes us to believe in multiple conspirators, perhaps even multiple attempts at poisoning. Yet observe, mes amis, the psychology of this deception." He moved with characteristic precision to stand before the assembled suspects, his small hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose of deep consideration. A true second attempt would be concealed, not displayed so conveniently for discovery. This vial was placed not to succeed, but to be found, to create confusion, to multiply suspects, to obscure the singular truth of tonight's crime. Miles Dacre, still trembling from his discovery, looked up with desperate hope. "Then you believe someone is trying to implicate me as well?" "I believe," Poirot replied carefully, "that our murderer possesses a mind of exceptional cunning. He understands that the most effective deception is not the simple lie, but the complex truth that leads to false conclusions." Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hotel corridor. Inspector Japp appeared in the doorway with a constable, and to everyone's surprise, Celeste Montfort walked beside them, her wrists unbound and her composure intact. "Before you bristle, Poirot," Japp announced without preamble. "Our chemist tested the contents of Miss Montfort's vial immediately. Pure benzaldehyde, perfume essence, nothing more. We found the receipt from Maison Ferraud in Paris, purchased a fortnight ago. She's not our poisoner." The revelation struck the assembled company like thunder. If Celeste Montfort was innocent, then the murderer remained among them, hidden behind a mask of respectability and false grief. Celeste inclined her head slightly toward Poirot. "It seems Fear's Bridge was not mine to build this evening, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot nodded with evident satisfaction, as if this development had been entirely expected. "Ah, mademoiselle, the truth begins to emerge from beneath its careful disguise. The vial in your wrap was planted, just as this second vial was planted in the serving area. Our murderer seeks to create an abundance of suspects while remaining invisible himself." Reverend Dane had been observing these developments with that same unsettling calm, his pale eyes reflecting neither surprise nor concern. When he spoke, his voice carried that scholarly appreciation that had marked his earlier observations. "Fascinating methodology, Monsieur Poirot," he said, rising from his chair with deliberate grace. "You speak of the murderer's psychology as if you could read his thoughts directly. Tell me, what is the most common flaw in such an elaborate scheme?" "Overconfidence," Poirot replied, his gaze fixed upon the clergyman with unwavering intensity. "The belief that one's intellect is superior, leading to a desire to demonstrate that superiority through excessive complexity. The criminal mind, however sophisticated, follows certain patterns, the need to show cleverness, the compulsion to complicate what should remain simple, the fatal flaw of intellectual pride." The words struck their target with surgical precision. For the first time since the evening's horrors began, Reverend Dane's composure showed genuine strain, his pale eyes flickering with something that might have been recognition or perhaps challenge. "Your deductions are most impressive," Dane replied, his voice carrying new undertones that chilled the room. "Yet you speak as if you know the murderer's identity with certainty. Surely that would be premature without concrete evidence." "Evidence?" Poirot's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. "But we have evidence in abundance, mon reverend. The forged note written in archaic script, the planted phrase that guided Sir Lionel's toast, the precise timing that required intimate knowledge of everyone present. Most importantly, we have the evidence of psychology itself." As if summoned by the mounting tension, a sharp cry echoed from the hotel's service corridor, followed by the unmistakable crash of breaking porcelain. We rushed toward the sound, finding Pembroke, the senior waiter, collapsed in the pantry beside an overturned coffee service. Dr. Pemberton's swift examination confirmed what the bitter almond scent in the air had already suggested: a second victim of cyanide poisoning. "The coffee service?" Poirot observed, examining the scene without disturbing the evidence. "Prepared for our comfort, but someone ensured that Monsieur Pembroke would taste it first. The one man whose memory could recall every movement during the champagne service, now silenced forever." Japp's face darkened with fury and frustration. "Right, that's it. No one moves, no one eats or drinks anything. This killer's not getting a third chance." Poirot nodded grimly, his gaze sweeping the assembled suspects who had followed us to witness this fresh horror. "Indeed, Inspector, our murderer has revealed himself through this second crime. The need to eliminate the witness shows desperation beneath the careful planning, and desperation, mes amis, is the enemy of the perfect crime." The elegant hotel had become a stage where death stalked the corridors, and Hercule Poirot's little grey cells were rapidly approaching their final, devastating conclusion. The discovery of Pembroke's body sent shockwaves through the remaining company, transforming the elegant hotel into a fortress of suspicion where death stalked the corridors with calculated precision. Inspector Japp immediately sealed all service areas and posted constables at every exit, his weathered face grim with the determination of a man who refused to let a killer claim a third victim. Poirot, however, moved with characteristic calm through the chaos, his keen eyes already processing the psychological implications of this second murder. As we returned to the dining hall with the assembled suspects, he positioned himself at the head of the table where Sir Lionel had delivered his fateful toast, his small hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose of deep concentration. "The elimination of Monsieur Pembroke," he announced to the tense gathering, "reveals our murderer's desperation beneath the careful planning. This was not part of the original design, mes amis, but a necessary improvisation to silence the one witness whose professional memory could expose the truth." He began his methodical questioning with deceptive gentleness, focusing on details that seemed almost trivial. "Lady Isabel, when you correspond with Monsieur Dac regarding seating arrangements, how do you typically describe the positions?" "In plain English," she replied, puzzled. "I write, 'Place Mr. So-and-so to the left of Sir Lionel,' or 'Seat Mrs. Arkwright between the doctor and Miss Vane.'" "And you, Sir Lionel?" "The same. I leave numbers to Dacre's charts." Poirot's attention shifted to Miles Dacre, whose nervousness had intensified visibly. "We use numbered positions when drafting the seating chart, Monsieur. Poirot, it eliminates confusion with large gatherings." "Precisely. And you, Reverend Dane?" "As Mr. Dacre does," came the measured reply. "Numbers eliminate ambiguity." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then continued his gentle interrogation. When asked to describe their seating positions naturally, the responses revealed a telling pattern. Lady Isabel spoke of being opposite the fireplace. Sir Lionel mentioned the head, and Miss Vane described herself as left of Astrid. But Miles Dacre caught himself saying position 12 before correcting to more natural language, while Reverend Dane answered without hesitation, position 9. "Language betrays us," Poirot murmured to me, his eyes gleaming with sudden understanding. "People reveal themselves not by what they know, but by how they speak of what they know." The coffee service investigation provided additional crucial evidence. Only one person had left the dining hall during the critical 15-minute window when the poison was administered, ostensibly to offer prayers for the dead in the service corridor. The timing was perfect, the access complete, and the knowledge of hotel routines intimate. "The psychology of this crime," Poirot continued, addressing the assembled suspects, "reveals someone who moves through institutional environments with professional ease. Hospitals, schools, charitable organizations, places where one learns to navigate complex hierarchies and predict human behavior with scientific precision." Astrid Arkwright looked up with dawning comprehension. "The letter Conrad burned. He said it came from someone who had been watching him for months, someone who knew details that only an intimate observer could possess. He was terrified because the writer understood his business practices better than his own partners." "Indeed, madame, your husband was being blackmailed, but not by Mademoiselle Montfort. The true extortionist was someone who moved through London society like a shadow, gathering secrets with the patience of a professional confessor." Celeste Montfort nodded grimly. "My letter to Conrad was a threat to expose him publicly through legitimate journalism. I had grown tired of being his victim and intended to turn the tables. But the true blackmailer could not permit such exposure," Poirot observed, his gaze fixing upon Reverend Dane with laser-like intensity. "For if Monsieur Arkwright's activities became public, they would inevitably lead to questions about his extortionist, questions that would reveal a pattern of exploitation extending far beyond a single victim." Reverend Dane's scholarly composure finally showed strain, his pale eyes blazing with an intelligence that was both brilliant and utterly without conscience. "You speak of patterns as if you could prove such elaborate theories, Monsieur Poirot. Yet theories without evidence remain merely intellectual exercises." "Evidence?" Poirot's smile was sharp as a blade. But more reverend, the evidence surrounds us. The forged note in archaic script, the planted phrase that guided Sir Lionel's toast, the precise knowledge of personalities and procedures, all pointing to someone whose profession provides intimate access to human secrets and institutional operations. The elegant dining hall had become a courtroom where truth and deception faced their final confrontation, and Hercule Poirot was about to deliver his verdict with the precision of divine judgment. The little grey cells had completed their work, and justice awaited only the final revelation. The elegant dining hall fell into absolute silence as Poirot positioned himself at the exact spot where Sir Lionel had delivered his fateful toast, his small figure commanding attention with the quiet authority of absolute certainty. He smoothed an already immaculate cuff, and the assembled suspects seemed to lean forward as if drawn by invisible strings, each waiting for the revelation that would transform this gathering into an audience for the exposure of calculated evil. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a master conductor preparing his final movement. "We have witnessed this evening not merely murder, but a performance of extraordinary psychological sophistication. Our killer orchestrated an entire evening of deception, manipulation, and misdirection with the precision of a master clockmaker." He moved with characteristic deliberation around the table, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail as if reading an illuminated manuscript. "Let us examine the method first. The poison reached only Monsieur Arkwright's glass, because it was never in the champagne itself. No, it was applied as a thin film, cyanide dissolved in oil, to the inner rim of his specific glass before service. When the champagne touched this coating, the poison dissolved instantly while the oil destroyed the effervescence. Hence Monsieur Arkwright's complaint that his drink was flat. He tasted his doom before he drank it." Inspector Japp nodded grimly, his notebook ready, while the assembled suspects watched with growing fascination and horror. "But this required absolute certainty that our victim would occupy the precise seat," Poirot continued. "Enter the forged note to Monsieur Dacre, written in archaic script by someone trained in paleography, the study of ancient handwriting. The note specified position 7 rather than descriptive language, revealing intimate knowledge of hotel procedures. Lady Isabel, you confirm that Reverend Dane possesses exactly such calligraphic skills for parish records." Lady Isabel's face had gone pale as comprehension dawned. "The medieval manuscripts," she whispered. "Paul showed me examples of his work." "Précisément." The second element was prediction. How did our murderer know Sir Lionel's toast in advance? The phrase, "bridge across fear," was planted in Sir Lionel's mind days earlier during a pastoral visit. Suggested so subtly that he believed it to be his own inspiration. When the moment came to compose his toast, the phrase bloomed naturally in his thoughts, allowing our killer to predict his exact words. Sir Lionel's face flushed with anger and realization. "The hospital visit last week, we discussed metaphors for charitable work. You said bridges were particularly meaningful symbols." Poirot's gaze fixed upon Reverend Dane, whose scholarly composure had hardened into something resembling carved stone. The third element was misdirection, the vial in Mademoiselle Montfort's wrap, the second vial planted in the serving area. These were theatrical props designed to multiply suspects and create confusion. A mind that loves its own cleverness too well, no? And finally, opportunity. Poirot's voice hardened. When Monsieur Pembroke threatened to remember too much about the champagne service, he had to die. Only one person left this room during the critical period with a reason none would challenge: to offer prayers for the dead. It granted movement through corridors, access to the service pantry, the quiet necessary to poison the coffee that silenced our faithful witness. The accusation hung in the air like a sword of justice. Reverend Dane rose slowly from his chair, his transformation now complete. The mild clergyman had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a predator whose intelligence was matched only by his complete absence of conscience. "Your deductions are most impressive, Monsieur Poirot," Dane said, his voice carrying new undertones of acknowledgement rather than denial. "I confess, the intellectual challenge has been exhilarating. Conrad Arkwright was indeed my victim, not my only one, I should add. The confessional provides remarkable opportunities for gathering leverage." The admission struck the room like lightning. Even Jap, seasoned by countless revelations, seemed stunned by the complete absence of remorse. "Arkwright discovered my activities and threatened exposure," Dane continued with scholarly detachment. "He had to be eliminated, but I saw no reason why his death shouldn't serve multiple purposes. Removing a threat while demonstrating the superiority of intellect over brute force." "And Pembroke?" Poirot asked quietly. "A regrettable necessity. His memory would have eventually compromised the perfection of my design." Poirot's expression showed something approaching sadness. "You speak of perfection, mon révérend, yet you have built not a cathedral of logic, but a labyrinth to worship your own pride. Justice seeks truth. You sought only to escape it." As Jap moved forward with handcuffs, Dane's pale eyes met Poirot's with something like professional respect. "You're quite right about everything, Monsieur Poirot. I congratulate you on a masterful performance." The elegant dining hall had become a courtroom where truth triumphed over the most sophisticated deception, and Hercule Poirot had once again demonstrated that the little grey cells, properly employed, could illuminate even the darkest corners of human nature. Order, at last, would follow disorder. The metallic click of Inspector Jap's handcuffs echoed through the elegant dining hall with the finality of justice served, yet Reverend Dane submitted to arrest with the serene composure of a man who regarded the proceedings as merely the conclusion to a fascinating intellectual exercise. His pale eyes held no trace of remorse, only the cold satisfaction of an artist whose masterpiece had been properly appreciated, even as it led to his downfall. "The irony is quite exquisite, don't you think?" Dane observed as the constables prepared to lead him away. "A shepherd using the tools of faith, confession, trust, pastoral guidance, to harvest the very secrets that would destroy his flock. Conrad Arkwright's gambling debts, his fraudulent charity claims, his embezzlement from foundation funds, all revealed in moments of supposed divine grace." Astrid Arkwright, who had maintained remarkable dignity throughout the evening's horrors, finally broke her composure. "You used God's house to destroy my husband," she whispered, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Whatever Conrad's sins, he deserved justice, not murder disguised as intellectual superiority." Poirot studied the unrepentant killer with something approaching clinical fascination. "You speak of irony, mon reverend, yet you have become the very corruption you claim to despise. The confessional transformed from sanctuary into marketplace, trust weaponized for personal gain. This is not justice. It is the disease of pride, more poisonous than any alkaloid compound." As Jap led Dane toward the door, the former clergyman paused for one final observation. "Tell me, Monsieur Poirot, in your pursuit of truth, have you never been tempted to exceed the boundaries of law? To use your knowledge of human nature for purposes beyond mere detection?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment the elegant dining hall seemed to hold its breath. Poirot's response came quietly but with absolute moral authority. "The temptation exists, mon ami, but so does the choice. We define ourselves not by our capabilities, but by the limits we impose upon them. You possessed the intelligence to serve humanity. Instead, you chose to exploit it." The door closed behind Dane and his escort, leaving the surviving company to process the evening's revelations. The transformation was immediate and profound, the restoration of truth after elaborate deception, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Sir Lionel approached Miles Dacre, whose face remained etched with remorse over his unwitting participation in the murder scheme. You'll stay with the Foundation, Miles. We don't abandon those who err loyally. Your integrity was used against you. That speaks to your character, not against it." Lady Isabel nodded her agreement, placing a comforting hand on the young secretary's shoulder. "We shall rebuild what this night has shaken, and we'll need every steady hand to restore trust." Celeste Montfort, her earlier composure now tinged with genuine emotion rather than journalistic detachment, offered her own perspective. Perhaps the most chilling aspect was his complete absence of remorse. He spoke of murder as if it were merely an academic exercise in applied psychology. "Indeed, mademoiselle," Poirot replied, adjusting his tie with characteristic precision. "The truly dangerous criminal is not the passionate killer who acts in rage, but the cold calculator who views human life as merely another variable in his equations. Pride, it blinds us to our own moral boundaries." Astrid Arkwright rose with quiet dignity, her grief tempered by a newfound resolve. "I shall ask for privacy for Conrad's family, but if part of my husband's legacy can be healing rather than harm, I will endow a ward for those who have been coerced. We are all more complicated than the obituaries suggest." As the surviving guests prepared to depart, each processing the evening's trauma in their own way, Poirot took one final survey of the dining hall where death had made its theatrical entrance. The overturned champagne glass remained covered by his protective napkin, a small monument to the evening's deadly deception. "Come, Hastings," he said, straightening his waistcoat and retrieving his coat. "The little grey cells have completed their work. Order has been restored, truth has triumphed over the most sophisticated falsehood, and justice will follow its proper course." As we stepped into the misty London evening, the gas-lit streets of Mayfair welcomed us back to a world where truth could still triumph over calculated evil. Behind us, the Belgrave Hotel returned to its customary elegance, though those who had witnessed tonight's events would carry the memory of how quickly respectability could mask the most dangerous corruption. "A most instructive case," Poirot observed, as our hansom cab clattered through the fog-shrouded streets. "It reminds us that the greatest dangers often wear the most trusted faces, and that true detection requires not merely the observation of facts, but the understanding of the human heart in all its terrible complexity." The affair of the guest who knew the toast before it was said had reached its conclusion, and Hercule Poirot's reputation for unraveling the most intricate psychological puzzles remained intact.